Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hardfire TV. My name is Cameron Weber. Thank you for watching our program. With me, I have John Clifton. Welcome back, John.
Hello.
It's been more than 4 years since the COVID lockdowns in 2020. And if you remember, we did a series of shows about that, about the disappearing civil rights during the lockdowns and then the spontaneous protests and all that. Anyway, it's been 4 years since the COVID lockdown, so it's time to do some stock taking. During the COVID era, there were reports of pressure on media outlets to suppress alternatives to the official National Institutes for Health and White House narratives of how best to deal with the pandemic. The Twitter files released in December 2022 showed that some of these so-called conspiracies were actually a correct picture of what was occurring. There was indeed administration pressure to suppress online media content, which was counter to that of CDC and NIH recommendations. Today's program is about the NIH and how its employees benefited from their own recommendations by getting royalties for the pharmaceutical solutions to COVID, and what we can do to prevent this from occurring again. Joining me is John Clifton. John, welcome back.
Thank you. Peace and freedom. Grace be with you.
To discuss government science. John is interested in civil liberties and is a conspiracy analyst and is active in the libertarian movement in Queens, New York. Looking forward to hearing your ideas, John.
Very well.
So OpenTheBooks.com. John, have you heard of OpenTheBooks.com before?
No, but I heard of, Open Secrets and similar organizations that politically act as watchdogs to make sure people have an idea what is actually spent on certain political projects, what's actually going on and behind the scenes.
Yeah, open the books. Just like, the Fed, if you've ever done central bank research, it's very impossible to find exactly what's going on. You can get aggregates, but you can't get details. Anyway, Open the Books is one of them. We would call investigative journalism. Released evidence today, June 2024, obtained using the Freedom of Information Act that the NIH and NIH employees received more than $700 million in royalty payments from pharmaceutical companies during 2022 and 2023. I'll put up a graph that shows the big spike in royalty payments during the COVID era. Individuals working for the NIH whose salaries are paid for by the US taxpayer also get personal royalties from private pharmaceutical companies. John, did you know that was going on?
I didn't quite know the details of it, but I will say that the COVID episode exposed a lot about the way money is moved in and out of these bureaucracies. I believe it was like this. I heard a figure in 2022 about there being like $350 million doled out in grants or bureaucratic funding over a decade. Up to 2020.
Yeah, exactly. The money hasn't even been spent yet. Exactly right. So anyway, the way it works is the pharmaceutical companies get royalties from when they participate in U.S. taxpayer funded research, right? So you have the NIH, private corporations working with the NIH, doing taxpayer funded research. And then the pharmaceutical companies are given the royalties by NIH. NIH also gives themselves as employees royalties, and they give NIH as an institution royalties. So the pharmas then recycle some of these royalties back to NIH and its employees who make the grants to these firms in the first place. We can see from Open the Books that the NIH and its employees benefit greatly from increased royalties during the COVID era.
It reminds me of that thing in the cartoons when one guy goes dealing out the money. 1, 2 for you, 1, 2 for you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for me. That sets up structurally an image of self-healing, just done on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, they're allowed to determine the royalty rates. the bureaucrats who are taxpayer funded are allowed to use the law to pay themselves royalties for, and they determine the pharma rates and rates for themselves. Anyway, it's crazy. So if you remember during COVID, so the point there is the National Institutes for Health employees have an incentive to force and to encourage and suggest the pharmaceutical vaccine solution instead of alternative solutions because they're making a profit on it. Right? So their self-interest might explain some of the censorship that went on about alternative solutions to the COVID problem, including the Swedish model.
This is the problem with bureaucracy and what we libertarians call the cult of the omnipotent state. We give some organization power, in bureaucratic power, it's unelected power, unrepresented power, and they end up making these determinations about the money, determinations about disputes, determinations about what to disclose, determinations about what the character is of any disclosure coming from any other party, and say, oh, no, don't believe anything you hear from anybody else. Just believe us. We're the ones. We're the smart guys.
They're very, very hypocritical. I have a typical, well, I guess typical New York socialist friend, and he says, man, everything those Republicans say, you know, they're doing the exact opposite. And I said, I feel the same way about the Democrats. They're both very hypocritical.
Just one detour to something maybe unrelated. When there's a group of people or organizations that are devoted to what we call tax honesty, where you discuss the actual liability of people to pay taxes and all that, and they point out the issue of half the time is they're saying there's a class of people who aren't subject to paying it, the income tax, that is, and they are not part of the jurisdiction of the IRS to be making rulings about. But if they have a dispute with the IRS sends them a correspondence saying, we have determined that there's nothing to you, anything that you're saying. They just presume they have the jurisdiction or make determinations, but they may or may not. You know,
so that's the administrative state. And so I call that death by 1,000 cuts. You got the NIH doing this, you have the IRS doing this, you have the Department of Commerce doing this, and it's just too many government of the self-anointed, right? And if you remember, Sweden didn't close the schools, but the US did close the schools, and that was the teachers' unions who encouraged that, right? As part of the coalition. Okay, part of the coalition of those supporting the NIH approaches includes Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, most of whom receive campaign donations from the same pharma firms who receive royalties from NIH research. So I'll put up a graph on that. Graphic on that. Pharmaceutical industry donated to 2/3 of Congress ahead of 2020 elections, right? COVID happens, pharmaceutical solution, and it's Congress who funds the NIH and the CDC, who gives them the appropriations to pay their employees. It's being discovered that information about the Great Barrington Declaration of October 2020, on which the Sweden model is based, was being monitored by members of the current administration. The administration recommended to media outlets which information to prioritize on the research engines. For example, Twitter's actions to suppress circulation about the Great Barrington Protocols is verified through the Twitter files. And I remember I gave a lecture a talk to my students about the Great Barrington Protocols about October 2020 when it was being suppressed. And then I tried to upload it to YouTube and it got rejected by YouTube. All right, so this means that both the Democrats and Republicans are supporting the NIH pharmaceutical solution to COVID. The NIH receives about $50 billion every year from Congress. The taxpayer-funded NIH programs create royalty profits for the pharma companies, who then pass a portion of these profits to Democrat and Republican congressional campaigns, as well as to the NIH and its employees. So that's the
and what you see there is this, you know, finger pointing. Maybe YouTube will perform its changes to its policies and its algorithms to exclude certain level of speech. If you question it, they'll say, well, this is what we get from the NIH and from Congress and or other bodies that is
Congress.
ruling on this. You go to those bodies and say, this is nonsense. What about these academic certified people who have an alternate view or an additional view?
Yeah, the Great American Protocol.
Take that up with YouTube.
Yeah, MIT. Someone from MIT was
Yeah.
about that. I mean, this has been going on, like I said, more than 4 years, and we're just now starting to understand what's been going on. So anyway, this is an example of what people call crony capitalism. This is where the state favors certain large insider firms, and both these firms and the state benefit while everyone else loses. This is especially true for small business who suffer more during economic lockdowns. They also have to bear the cost of implementing mandates to benefit the insiders creating the mandates.
Yeah, I would say that there is again a circular thing around here where they are determining these mandates. They get approval already through the mechanism, the dog and pony show of government and industry hearings and supervision process, but nothing's really holding them accountable ultimately for what they do. They just go through the motions of having hearings in which this is what we're doing, and they ask them what else they're going to be doing, and they talk about that. And then if they do wrong, what happens? They just hold another hearing eventually, and
well,
they just go round and round again.
What the NIH did was they purposely, during the Freedom of Information Act, OpenTheBooks, they purposely misspelled people's names, so you couldn't actually trace it to the employees. So they were not forthcoming in their information, is what you're saying. Yes.
Yes, there's a ways to avoid accountability. There's also ways, they say, in other respects, to make certain distributions of funds fungible, in that you can be getting them for one purpose, but can change some terminology in the paperwork, and it turns out the money goes elsewhere. You can again have money going to individuals who are making determinations about what the wisdom of what they're doing, and of course the bias is created in terms of them saying
their interest is to support the COVID vaccine as opposed to personal responsibility. Yes, determine that. So anything that transpires evidence from the past which occurred to support suppression of moves counter to that, well, of course, because the NIH is self-interested, so they're supporting their, I hate to be such a crass economist, public choice economist, but I didn't believe it when I first heard that they were royalties. No, they wouldn't. Money is not that important. But how else can you explain the behavior?
This is the crux of the matter. In society, we believe in the distribution of division of labor, and we trust these people who are specialized to do this. It's those specialized to do something else to do that, and we presume that the experts are self-interested in being competent and being correct and being responsible. We know from another matter, the famous Hunter Biden laptop. 51 intelligence experts said, "Oh, there's nothing to this."
Yeah. We would like to believe that they're being responsible.
Yeah, but, and here you got these experts self-defined or self-credentialed as being correct on COVID because they're the ones researching it. They were assigned to do and they're the ones funding whatever vaccine.
We're kind of straying off our top a little bit, but the one about the Hunter, I'm not mentioning.
I'm choosing that.
Not mentioning names, but the one about the laptop. Yeah, that was the 51 people who signed that. Many of those were confirmed by Congress to their posts. Yeah, but right. So back to the COVID. The phrase crony capitalism implies that the parties are doing something illegal. Nothing in the NIH situation is illegal, except maybe withholding the information that we mentioned. maybe a better term might be corporatism.
Yeah.
Corporatism or state capitalism, where a few large firms control industry in conjunction with the state. And of course, the number of smaller firms that shut down during COVID because they couldn't afford the mandates and they weren't big enough to get the grants, went out of business, where the larger firms stay in business and are closer in with the state. And that's corporatism, right?
It is. What I was getting at before is that we have a commitment to the cult of the expert, even when it's potentially or structurally compromised by the way in which they are receiving funding and are in turn funding each other in their enterprise.
Yeah,
And it's just compromising their expertise,
exactly.
but they're profiting from it. So why would they say anything different than
Well,
what?
that's just too bad. You know, that's too bad that you would prioritize just as royalties. You know, 700 million in royalties. How many? What does that break down for to whom? We don't know.
Yeah.
You know, that's a lot of royalties, but is it worth it to lie, cheat, and steal and compromise people's civil rights in the doing of it? Okay, so let's attempt to identify a solution to the problem by further identifying the problem. This would be the Patent and Trademark Law Amendments Act of 1980, also known as the Bayh-Dole Act. I'll put that up. The Bayh-Dole Act, or the Patent and Trademark Law of 1980. And so if you remember 1980, I do, the Cold War was going, Star Wars was starting, and the purpose of the 1980 Act was to commercialize the discoveries and inventions in US government laboratories during the Cold War around the Star Wars era. Agencies who are funding research, which leads to a patent, have the discretion to share royalties from these patents as they see fit. So these are government employees working in government labs being paid for by US taxpayers are able to privately determine the royalties for US government paid for research. And that's the 1980 Act during the Cold War. This includes the private firms to whom they give grants and to the agency's own employees. This law applies to the NIH, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Commerce. So the way to get rid of government-funded science and the counter and the screwed up incentives that gives to government employees is to overturn this act so that it doesn't happen anymore.
Well, a more simplified way of doing it, just as an alternative way of discussing this, is to just get rid of government-funded organizations that are public organizations. There should be a creation or an encouragement of a purely private organization that does this research, and it's called into Congress the same way a private sector corporation is called in, if it's a leading industry, to report on what its research has amounted to or what its activity is. And any questions about the legality or in the effectiveness is dealt with, again, through Congress, through its regular oversight, without this shadow game of trying to pretend that this government organization is separate from the government, basically, by doing these oversight.
But people can't. You're saying the NIH?
Yeah,
you consider it independent when it's really not.
No, it's not, especially when it's so dependent on this funding, and then it's given almost unilateral authority to do whatever it wants with this money in terms of
it gets $50 billion, and you know, that buys a nice big building in Geneva probably for that to work there with the UN organizations there. Yeah, so it's having this act which allows royalties sends up unintended consequences.
Yes.
and what like I mentioned, the 1980 Act also excludes those government employees who receive royalty payments from having to disclose these royalties, which was your point.
Right.
the whole open the books idea. So they don't have to disclose these royalties, and this is what has gained the most attention, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
I want to comment on this. There was,
Yeah.
I think, commentator Cal Thomas who said the answer to life's problems are simple, but you've avoided the simple answers so far. That's why everything gets so complex. And you've got bureaucracy and rules and policies like this that basically complicate everything without accomplishing much.
5
And
minutes.
that's why things are the way they are.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's entangled political economy. There's so many different layers that it's impossible to get down to what the truth is and where the funding's coming from. And but these layers, this entangled political economy is becoming untangled as we're looking at the myriad funding flows supported by both parties, the suppression of speech against the government solution. And these things are now becoming evident. Yeah, what we should also think about the people who lost their jobs during the COVID era because they were afraid of needles, or they for religious reasons didn't want to take it, or for whatever reason,
medical privacy reasons. Like I always use the example of, I don't want to go into a restaurant and give the restaurant my vaccination status or private medical information in order to sit down and eat a McNugget.
or
That's what we're subjected to.
Or people who believe that natural immunity was the way to go, and that the COVID vaccine just gets in the way.
Yes.
So those people lost their work and their livelihood because of these government mandates without, right? So
what is the process for them getting their careers back, their money back?
Well, we're talking about what happened.
Is there did anybody even apologize to them?
No, no one's ever apologized, and that's the thing. And no one. And I have a friend who's got several friends who are immigrants to the United States. Is a great beacon on the hill, right? And they were very in shock that the 2020 elections weren't audited, for example, and are very shocked that what happened during the COVID era with the NIH and the funding flows was not audited. But I told them, well, we're doing that now. We're making it known now on our program on Hardfire.
Right.
So the best thing to do is to repeal the 1980 Act to end the government's right to determine profits and royalties. Profits for private firms should not be allowed in government research. That's corporatism. I mean, that's what Mussolini did, right?
And I think if that happens, if you go to my solution, which is more of a strictly more private sector solution, their violation in terms of inaccuracies, in terms of what they're not disclosing, it's crucial. And all that would be more severely dealt with if there's any subjecting of their findings and their activities to oversight committees.
Yeah, well, it took 2.5 years for the mainstream media to accept that the certain laptop was actually the certain person's laptop. But also and it
took 4 years for them to acknowledge the actual credibility of the statement that there was something involving the with COVID. There was the Wuhan lab had a lot to do with what happened,
which was NIH funded. Was NIH funded.
Yeah,
some of
this they wouldn't tell you that it was. They would say, "No, conspiracy theory."
Yeah,
conversation.
Yeah,
we needed conspiracy analysis the most in that particular case for a situation that was affecting everybody, literally.
Well, and people lost their work, and that's not right. Okay. From a public choice perspective, it's no wonder that the NIH is enforcing their vaccine when they have so much to gain from it. Let's watch out for next time. What's
there was dishonesty at the top, and it needs to be toppled.
And it was very, very well coordinated.
Yes, it was. Again, analysis would have found that out if it had been allowed to happen.
Well, we're doing the analysis now. And one of the things that I would like to research next is I heard that the previous governor of New York, no names, but that they signed their book their book deal 2 weeks before the national emergency was declared. And so if anything was like really well planned from the top, that would be evidence of that. That's just that's a separate issue.
Yeah, but that more or less confirms what we've been saying about it. Too much self-dealing going on around here.
Yeah. So anyway, we've identified the problem with the National Institutes for Health, and what we heard about were royalty payments during the COVID era, which we found out have been true, but to private individuals who work for NIH, and we don't have the ability to find out because the records have been altered before they go through the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. And again, if they're going to have government be in oversight position, they'll have to be positions or situations where the interests of the public supersede, the proprietary interests of the corporation to protect its information.
So maybe what we're talking about will be in the New York Times in 2 years' time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll find out eventually. Who did it?
Yeah. Oh, who? You mean if there's one person in charge of the whole situation? That's we've been talking George Soros. We've been throwing that around. Who's in charge since the original lockdown here in New York?
You can even say Bill Gates. You can even say
I would say that. I would say
anybody a friend of Phil who's on Fauci's Rolodex, are protected people.
They're not our friend, no.
Yeah.
Right. We have just 1 minute left. I think we agree that the 1980 patent and trademark law should be overturned. Thank you, John, for joining us to help unpeel the onion.
Yeah.
Great to discuss this with you. And thank you to our viewers. Thank you for watching Hardfire TV. Each of our episodes appears 6 times monthly on the Brooklyn Free Speech Network, both on cable in New York City wide and streaming through the BRIC Arts Media House. We have more than 50 programs. John, we've probably done about 10 together. We have more than 50 programs about classical liberal ideas on our YouTube channel. Just search for Hardfire TV and Brooklyn Free Speech. See you next time.